Zuri's lungs burned as she sprinted through the rain-slicked alleyway, her sneakers skidding on the wet cobblestones of Gangnam. Behind her, the heavy boots of Director Kim's hired security echoed off the brick walls, men sent to ensure the corruption she had witnessed at the hospital never saw the light of day. The neon signs of Seoul blurred into streaks of pink and blue, a beautiful city that was suddenly a suffocating trap. She lunged toward a black sedan idling at the end of the block, a door swinging open like a dark mouth. She didn't know who was inside, but behind her was a shallow grave, and in front of her was a chance. The car sped away, the interior smelling of expensive sandalwood and cold ozone. 20 minutes later, she was standing in the marble foyer of an estate that looked more like a fortress, her soaked scrubs clinging to her curves and her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're late, Nurse Miller," a voice rasped. Zuri turned and froze. In the center of the room sat Nam Deun. He was younger than the rumor suggested, with sharp features and wet, black hair that looked like it had been carved from obsidian. He was strapped into a custom-built, high-tech throne, a motorized wheelchair with a control console so complex it looked like a cockpit. A dark neck tattoo crept up from his collar, disappearing under a jawline that was tight with restrained dominance. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and calculating, while his fingers rested motionless on the huge joystick of his chair. Zuri stood her ground, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and the quiet defiance that had kept her alive this long. "I was told you needed a nurse," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Deun tilted his head, his gaze traveling over her bare vulnerability. "I don't need a nurse," he whispered, the threat in his tone unmistakable. "I need someone who can handle the weight of my secrets without breaking. Tell me, Zuri, are you strong enough to handle this?" Zuri just jumped from the frying pan into the fire. "Would you trust a man who commands an empire from a chair?" Drop a yes or a no in the comments. If you're hooked on this forbidden tension, smash that like button and subscribe. Don't blink, the power shift in this house is about to get dangerous. The black sedan didn't just deliver Zuri to a house, it surrendered her to a fortress. As the iron gates of the Nam estate hissed shut behind them, the rain-slicked neon of Seoul was replaced by the oppressive silence of Cheongbuk-dong. The air inside the foyer was thick with the scent of floor wax and expensive cologne, a sterile luxury that felt like a velvet-lined coffin. A man stood at the base of the marble staircase, arms folded. He was a mountain of muscle with scarred knuckles and eyes that didn't blink, Taewon, the head of security who had looked at her like she was a virus in the elevator. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he handed her a sleek, encrypted smartphone and a silver ID badge. "3 rules, Nurse Miller," he rasped, his English heavy and sharp. "You do not speak to the other staff. You do not enter any room without your badge. And you never, under any circumstances, ask about the boss's business." Zuri clutched the phone, her damp fingers leaving smudges on the glass. "I'm a nurse, not a prisoner," she countered, her voice echoing in the hollow space. Taewon's expression didn't shift, but he stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her. "In this house, those are the same thing. You wanted protection? This is the price." He gestured to the silent guards standing like statues near every exit, their hands resting habitually near their holsters. The tour was a blur of minimalist architecture and high-definition cameras that tracked her every micro-movement. On the 3rd floor, Taewon stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. "His suite," he whispered, finally looking at her with something that felt like a warning. "He is resting. For now." He handed her a physical contract, the ink still fresh. Zuri scanned the lines. The salary was triple what she had expected, but the non-disclosure agreement was written in a way that suggested the penalty for talking wasn't a lawsuit, but a disappearance. Just as she reached for the handle of her own room, a soft chime rang from her new phone. A single message flashed on the screen: "Check the oxygen levels in the gym cabinet. Now." It wasn't signed, but the command carried the weight of Nam Deun's restrained dominance. Zuri looked back at the empty hallway, but the silent security team had vanished into the shadows, leaving her alone with the realization that in this gilded cage, the walls weren't just watching, they were waiting for her to fail. The gym on the second floor felt less like a place for recovery and more like a cold, glass-walled laboratory. Zuri stood by the medical cart, her hands steady but her pulse thrumming as Nam Do-yoon was wheeled in by Taewon. The heavy, motorized hum of his wheelchair, the huge joystick console glowing with soft blue light, was the only sound in the room. Without a word, Taewon assisted Do-yoon onto a low leather table and retreated into the shadows of the doorway, his presence a silent sentinel. Zuri's task was to prep his skin for a series of muscle-stimulating electrodes, a routine designed to combat atrophy. She approached the table, her shadow falling over him. Do-yoon's shirt was off, draped over the back of his chair, revealing a torso that defied the logic of a 3-year paralysis. His muscles were lean and defined, crisscrossed by the vibrant, dark ink of a YE tattoo, a sprawling dragon that wound its way from his shoulder down to the small of his back. As Zuri dipped a cloth into a basin of warm water and began to wipe away the traces of his morning sweat, she felt the first surge of unexpected heat. Her fingers brushed against the skin of his upper thigh, and instead of the cool, clammy texture characteristic of paralyzed limbs, his skin was radiating a feverish warmth. It was the heat of a body in active recovery, of muscles that were being pushed in secret. Do-yoon's jaw tightened, his sharp features illuminated by the overhead surgical lights. He looked forward, refusing to meet her eyes, but his breathing had changed. It was no longer the shallow, rhythmic breath of a patient, it was the hitched, heavy respiration of a man under intense physical strain. Zuri moved the cloth lower, her touch lingering on a particularly intricate section of the dragon's tail near his knee. Suddenly, she saw it, a micro-twitch in the lateral muscle of his calf. It was subtle, barely a ripple, but to an ER-trained nurse, it was a thunderclap. Paralyzed muscles did not twitch with that kind of controlled tension. She paused, her cloth hovering over the ink. The air in the gym grew heavy, thick with the smell of antiseptic and the raw, electric friction between them. "Is something wrong, nurse?" Do-yoon asked. His voice was a low rasp, dripping with restrained dominance. He finally turned his head, his dark, tousled hair falling over eyes that were no longer distant, but piercingly focused on her parting lips. Zuri's fingers trembled as she felt a distinct, deliberate pulse beneath her palm, a rhythmic surge of blood flow that shouldn't exist. She looked up, caught between her professional duty to report the miracle, and the instinctive fear that she had just discovered the one secret she was never meant to handle. Do-yoon's hands suddenly shot out, his grip on the edge of the table so tight his knuckles turned white, his neck tattoo pulsing as his heart rate spiked. He wasn't just warm, he was burning, and the pressure in the room made it feel as though the glass walls were about to shatter. The dining room was a cavern of shadows and polished obsidian, dominated by a table that could easily seat 20, yet only 2 places were set at the far end. Do-yoon sat at the head in his high-tech chair, the blue light from the console casting a ghostly hue over his sharp, composed features. He had traded his gym attire for a crisp, black dress shirt, the silk straining slightly over his shoulders. Zuri sat to his right, hyper-aware of the silence that seemed to vibrate with the secrets she had uncovered in the gym. A silent server placed a spread of intricate Korean delicacies between them, but the air was too thick with unspoken threats for Zuri to find an appetite. Do-yoon didn't eat, he simply watched her, his dark eyes tracking the way her fingers curled tightly around her silverware. "The hospital director called the estate this evening," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous velvet. "He offered a significant sum for your return. He claims you stole sensitive data before you fled." Zuri's heart hammered against her ribs, her wide eyes meeting his. "It's a lie. I saw what they were doing to the insurance records. I'm the liability, not a thief." "I know," Do-yoon replied, leaning back as the huge joystick hummed under his touch. "In my world, truth is a commodity, and right now, yours is very expensive. I've already neutralized the men he sent to your apartment. They won't be bothering you again." He paused, a faint, chilling smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But protection isn't a gift, Zuri. It's an investment. I need to know if you're the type of woman who breaks when the pressure turns internal. He reached out, his hand moving with a predatory slowness toward her glass of wine. As he moved, the hem of his sleeve shifted, revealing more of the dark ink on his wrist, and the way his forearm muscles corded with a strength that shouldn't exist in a man whose body was supposedly failing. He didn't pick up the glass, he tipped it, watching the red liquid bleed across the white linen, creeping towards Zuri's hand. You saw the twitch today, he whispered, his gaze locking onto her parted lips. You felt the heat. Most nurses would have run to Dr. Han to report a miracle. But you didn't. Why? The power in the room shifted. He wasn't just testing her medical ethics, he was gauging her complicity. Zuri didn't pull her hand away from the encroaching wine. She stood her ground, her quiet strength rising to meet his restrained dominance. Because a miracle in this house feels more like a trap, she countered. Duyun's expression tightened, his jaw set in a hard line. He leaned forward, standing on the precipice of his own secrets, his face inches from hers. The scent of sandalwood and danger was overwhelming. Just as the silence became unbearable, the security phone in his console chirped, a red alert that flashed across the screen, reflecting in his black eyes. He didn't look at the screen, he kept his eyes on her, his fingers gripping the joystick so hard the plastic groaned. The front gate has been breached, he said softly, and I haven't decided yet if I'm going to let you stay in the room when the blood starts to spill. The breach at the gate had been a diversion, a test of the estate's outer layers that left the house humming with a secondary, more intimate vibration. Following the dinner, the air in the master suite was thick, humid with the mist drifting from the open door of the spa-grade bathroom. Duyun had demanded a high-intensity hydrotherapy session, a task that forced Zuri into the confined, marble-lined shower space. Steam swirled around them, clinging to the glass walls and turning the air into a wet weight. Zuri's scrubs were already soaked through, the fabric translucent and heavy against her skin, revealing every curve she usually kept hidden beneath professional starch. She stood inches away from Duyun, who was positioned on a waterproof bench, the huge joystick of his mobile unit parked just outside the glass door. The water hissed from the overhead rainfall shower, a steady drumming that muffled the world outside. As she moved to adjust the temperature, her foot slipped on the slick stone, sending her stumbling forward. Duyun didn't just catch her, he reacted. His hands shot out, his fingers locking onto her waist with a grip that was precise, powerful, and entirely too fast for a man with a shattered spine. The collision was a shock of heat and wet skin. Zuri gasped, her wide eyes locked onto his. Standing inches away, she saw him clearly through the mist, the sharp features, the wet, tousled black hair, and the dark neck tattoo that seemed to pulse as his jaw tightened. The dynamic shattered. He wasn't looking at her as a nurse, and she was no longer seeing a patient. The restrained dominance he usually projected from his chair was now a raw, physical presence. His eyes were dark, burning with a conflicted intensity that mirrored her own, fear and defiance. Water dripped between them, the sound of the shower becoming a roar in her ears. Zuri could feel the solid, corded muscle of his arms, the heat of his torso through her wet clothes, a body that was not only alive but seemingly waiting for a command to strike. You should let go, she whispered, her breath hitching, her lips slightly parted as she felt his thumb press into the soft curve of her side. And if I can't, he countered, his voice a low vibration that traveled through her entire frame. He didn't move away. Instead, he pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, his chest nearly brushing hers. The unspoken threat of his recovery hung in the air, more dangerous than the men at the gate. As his gaze dropped to her mouth, the steam seemed to thicken, trapping them in a moment of forbidden tension, where the only thing more terrifying than the truth was the possibility that he might finally stand up and show her exactly what he was capable of. The steam from the shower had barely dissipated when the atmosphere in the suite shifted from physical heat to cold, calculated aggression. Duyun sat in his high-tech chair, his tousled black hair still damp, but his attention was fixed entirely on the huge joystick console. Zuri watched from the edge of the room, her heart still racing from their collision, but the man before her had retreated back into a shell of restrained dominance. As he moved the joystick, the blue glow of the interface projected complex streams of code across his sharp features, a digital waterfall that moved too fast for the human eye to track. Zuri stepped closer, ostensibly to check his heart rate, but her eyes fell on the primary monitor embedded in the armrest. She expected to see medical vitals or estate security feeds. Instead, she saw a series of encrypted ledger transfers flickering with the logos of international banks. The joystick was not just a steering mechanism for a paralyzed man, it was a sophisticated interface for a ghost. With every flick of his wrist, Duyun wasn't just navigating a room, he was navigating the global financial infrastructure. "You're looking at things that shorten lifespans, nurse," Duyun said without turning his head. His voice was a flat, dangerous rasp. Zuri ignored the warning, her nursing instincts giving way to a sudden, sharp realization. She saw a specific account name flash on the screen, the private offshore fund of Director Kim, the man who had chased her into this beautiful cage. Under Duyun's thumb, the account balance was hemorrhaging numbers, the digits spiraling toward zero. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was an extraction. Duyun was systematically bleeding his enemies dry before they even knew the war had started. The power in the room shifted as Zuri realized the extent of his inner turmoil. He wasn't just a victim of a coup, he was a predator in hiding, using his alleged weakness as the ultimate smokescreen for digital warfare. He looked up then, his dark eyes locking onto hers, the neck tattoo pulsing with the rhythm of his focus. "He's broke, Zuri," Duyun whispered, a chilling satisfied edge to his words. "By morning, your director will be more desperate than you were in that alleyway." He leaned forward, the console humming with a low-frequency vibration that made the floor tiles tremble. He grabbed her wrist, not with the heat of the shower, but with a cold, iron-like certainty. "But a man with nothing is the most dangerous kind of beast. Now that I've taken his money, he's coming for the only thing he thinks he has left, you." The console suddenly turned a violent, flashing red, and the sound of a distant, muffled explosion rocked the foundations of the estate, leaving the air between them thick with the smell of ozone and impending blood. The dust from the tremor had barely settled when the emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in a bloody, oscillating crimson. Duyun sat amidst the chaos, his face a mask of restrained dominance, even as the huge joystick console sparked with dying electricity. Zuri knelt before him, checking his vitals with quiet strength, her fingers lingering on the frantic pulse at his neck. The explosion hadn't just rattled the walls, it had cracked the shell of his silence. "It wasn't a car accident, Zuri," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp that cut through the whine of the security sirens. He reached out, his hand gripping the arm of his chair so hard the leather groaned, his inner turmoil finally bleeding into his expression. He gestured to the sprawling dragon tattoo on his back, the ink that she now knew hidden, a body that was not only alive but seemingly waiting for a command to strike. The new information hit like a second blast. It wasn't Director Kim or a rival syndicate that had put him in this chair, it was a ghost from his own bloodline. "The man who put the bullets in my back, the one who watched me fall 15 feet onto that concrete, he didn't do it for money," Duyun whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a devastatingly vulnerable intensity. "He did it because he thought I was too soft to lead. My own brother, Minho, is the one who broke me." The power shifted as Zuri realized the beautiful cage she lived in was actually a front-row seat to a fratricidal war. Duyun wasn't just hiding from the law, he was hiding from a sibling who knew all his weaknesses and was currently leveling the estate to finish the job. This was the ghost of the coup, the secret that had fueled his self-destruction at 3 a.m. and his digital warfare. "He's not just coming for the organization anymore," Duyun gritted out, his neck tattoo pulsing, as he forced his supposedly paralyzed hand to slide across the console to a hidden compartment. He pulled out a small, encrypted drive and shoved it into her hand. He knows about you, Zuri. He knows you're the only reason I'm standing, literally and figuratively. If they breach this room, you don't save me. You take this and you run. Outside, the sound of heavy gunfire erupted in the hallway, followed by a scream that was cut short, leaving the door as the only thing between them and the ghosts of the past.
The heavy oak door groaned under the impact of a stray bullet, and the red emergency lights finally died, plunging the master suite into a suffocating, absolute darkness. The air was thick with the smell of scorched wiring and the metallic tang of blood from the hallway. Duyun's huge joystick console went dark, the hum of his lifeline silenced. In the void, Zuri could hear the frantic, wet wheeze of his breathing, the sound of a body beginning to go into shock as the stress of the invasion triggered a massive autonomic surge. Taewon. I need light. Zuri shouted, her quiet strength cutting through the chaos of the gunfire outside. She didn't wait for a response. Moving by instinct and the memory of the room's layout, she lunged for her medical bag. Her curvy frame brushed against the heavy furniture as she navigated the pitch-black space, her fingers finding the tactical flashlight she'd tucked into her belt. The beam cut through the dark, landing on Duyun. He was slumped in his chair, his face gray, his neck tattoo stark against skin that had gone cold and clammy. The door burst open, and Taewon stumbled in, his shoulder bleeding, his scarred knuckles white as he gripped his weapon. He stopped, frozen by the sight of his boss's deteriorating state. He's dying, Taewon rasped, his eyes wide with a rare, naked fear. He's not dying today, Zuri snapped, her nurse's training taking total command of the room. She shoved her flashlight into Taewon's hand. Hold this steady. Don't look at the door, look at his chest. With practiced efficiency, she tore open a kit and prepped a sublingual blood pressure regulator. She ignored the sound of boots running toward their position, focusing entirely on the restrained dominance that was slipping away from the man in the chair. As she stabilized Duyun, checking his pulse against the roar of the building's collapsing security, Taewon watched her. The head of security, who had once viewed her as a virus or a prisoner, now stood in silent awe of her emotional intensity and clinical precision. She wasn't just a guest anymore, she was the only thing standing between the NAM organization and total decapitation. Duyun's eyes flickered open, locking onto hers as his breathing finally leveled out, but the moment was shattered by the sound of a heavy battering ram hitting the suite's inner door. The power was still out, the guards were looking to her for orders, and the ghost of Minho was just inches from breaching their final sanctuary. The aftermath of the breach left the estate's air conditioning dead, the summer heat of Seoul turning the master suite into a humid pressure cooker. In the grand bathroom, the oversized soaking tub was filled with mineral-rich water, the steam rising in thick, lazy curls that blurred the line between reality and the forbidden tension simmering between them. Duyun sat on the edge of a marble bench, his wet, tousled black hair clinging to his forehead, while Zuri knelt before him. Her scrubs were once again damp, the fabric outlining her curvy silhouette with a bare vulnerability that made the air feel thin. She was supposed to be performing a routine sensory check, a task that required her to move a sharp medical probe along his lower limbs. But the steamy truth from the shower still haunted her. She knew about the microtwitch and the feverish warmth. She knew his body was seemingly waiting for a command to strike. As she pressed the metal tool against the sprawling dragon tattoo on his calf, she didn't look at the limb, she looked directly into his eyes, her gaze caught between fear and defiance. How much of this do you actually feel, Duyun? She whispered, her voice a low vibration in the quiet room. Duyun's jaw-tight expression didn't flicker. Nothing. It's dead weight, nurse. Zuri's quiet strength flared. She discarded the probe and placed her bare palms against his skin, her fingers splaying over the corded muscle of his thigh. She felt the rhythmic surge of blood flow that defied his diagnosis. Liar, she challenged, leaning forward until they were standing inches away. You're not just recovering, you're hiding. You let me see you like this, vulnerable, dependent, Because it's the only way you know how to control me. The power in the room shifted violently. Do-yoon's restrained dominance cracked, his inner turmoil spilling out as he grabbed her wrists. His grip wasn't that of a man with muscle atrophy, it was iron. He pulled her closer, his sharp features cast in shadow, his neck tattoo pulsing with an unspoken threat. "You think you want the truth?" he rasped, his breath hitching as he fought the urge to simply stand up and end the charade. He didn't release her. Instead, he forced her hands higher, pinning them against the solid heat of his chest. "If I tell you everything, Zuri, you don't get to go back to being just a nurse. You become an accomplice to a dead man." Before she could answer, a sharp, rhythmic tapping echoed from the bathroom mirror, not a knock, but a coded signal. Someone was inside the walls, and the limitations Do-yoon had spent years perfecting were about to be his only protection or his final tomb. The silence following the coded signal was more deafening than the gunfire from the previous night. Zuri retreated from the bath's edge, her hands still tingling from the heat of Do-yoon's chest and the iron grip of his hands. To steady her nerves, she turned to her medical kit, the one piece of her old life she still clung to with quiet strength. She began to reorganize her supplies, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency through the vials and bandages until she reached the bottom compartment where she kept her spare stethoscope. Her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, a cold object that didn't belong among the soft gauze. She pulled it out, a thumb-sized, high-tech tracking disc, its tiny red LED blinking like a malevolent eye in the whispers in the dark. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just a refugee in this beautiful cage, she was a beacon. Director Kim hadn't just been trying to neutralize her, he had been using her to find the one man capable of dismantling his empire. This device had been broadcasting the estate's coordinates from the very moment she stepped into the black sedan. Every conversation, every forbidden tension, and every secret she had uncovered was now compromised. "Do-yoon," she whispered, her voice strained tight with pain as she held the device up for him to see. Do-yoon wheeled closer, the huge joystick of his console emitting a low, predatory growl as it cut through the humid air. His sharp features went from restrained dominance to pure venom as he looked at the blinking light. He didn't take the device from her, he grabbed her wrist again, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a devastatingly vulnerable intensity. "He didn't send them to kill you, Zuri," Do-yoon rasped, his neck tattoo pulsing with a lethal clarity. "He sent them to follow you." The breach at the gate, the explosion, it was all to see how I would react. To see if the paralyzed boss would finally stand up. The power shifted as Zuri realized she was the unwitting pawn who had led the wolf to the door. The tapping behind the mirror grew louder, more rhythmic, and now, more urgent. It wasn't just Minho's men outside, the director's specialized recovery team was already inside the perimeter, guided by the very kit she used to save Do-yoon's life. Do-yoon reached for the huge joystick, but instead of navigating, he smashed his hand into a hidden panel on the side of the chair, his jaw tight as he prepared to reveal the final, most dangerous part of his rehab and revenge. The tracking device in Zuri's hand suddenly turned a steady, unblinking green, a signal that the signal had been received, and the silence was about to be broken by a final, desperate breach. The discovery of the tracking device acted like a catalyst, turning the humid silence of the suite into a pressurized chamber. Zuri stood frozen, the blinking green light in her palm marking her as the unwitting architect of their potential downfall. Do-yoon's restrained dominance had vanished, replaced by a tense and conflicted energy that radiated from him in waves. He didn't look at the door or the mirrors, his eyes locked forward on Zuri, his jaw tight with a realization that the time for games had ended. The huge joystick on his console groaned as he forced the chair toward her, the motorized hum sounding like a low, predatory growl. He didn't stop until his knees, legs she knew were burning with hidden life, braced against hers. He reached up, his hands locking onto her waist with a strength that was precise, powerful, and entirely too fast. The forbidden tension that had been building since the alleyway finally snapped. Zuri didn't pull away. Her quiet strength shifted into a bare vulnerability as she leaned into the emotional intensity of the moment. She placed her hands on his shoulders, feeling the corded muscle beneath his silk shirt, her fingers lacing through his as she realized this was the point of no return. This was the forbidden collision. When he pulled her down, the kiss was soft and fierce, a release of weeks of tension that ignored every medical protocol and ethical boundary. It was charged with the rhythm of his focus, his thumb brushing her cheek with devastating gentleness even as his other hand tangled in her braids. In the confined space, the air felt thin and electric, the scent of sandalwood and danger overwhelming her senses. "You should have left, Zuri," he whispered against her lips, his breath hitching in a way that revealed his inner turmoil. "Now, there is no nurse. There is only us." The power had shifted completely, she was no longer his caretaker, and he was no longer her patient. They were two damaged people choosing each other despite every reason not to. But as the first moment of true physical intimacy reached its peak, a sharp, rhythmic tapping echoed from the bathroom mirror again, louder, faster, and accompanied by the distinct, metallic snick of a deadbolt being bypassed from the inside. The unspoken threat was no longer outside the walls, it was entering the room, and they were caught in the most vulnerable position possible. The metallic snick of the deadbolt was the only warning before the sanctuary of the master suite was fully compromised. The forbidden collision had left Zuri's pulse racing, but the sudden intrusion of a shadow from behind the bathroom mirror forced her nursing instincts back into high gear. A man dressed in the dark, tactical gear of Director Kim's specialized recovery team stepped into the room, a silenced pistol raised with clinical precision. He didn't look at Zuri, his eyes locked forward on the paralyzed boss in the chair. "Get out, Zuri." Duyun's voice was a low, jagged rasp, his jaw tight as he gripped the huge joystick of his console. The restrained dominance he usually projected was gone, replaced by a vulnerable desperation as he realized he couldn't protect her while strapped into the leather throne. The assassin ignored him, his finger tightening on the trigger. Zuri stood her ground, her quiet strength manifesting as a stubborn determination. She looked at the door, the clear exit that led to the back stairwell and the safety of the night, and then she looked at Duyun, the man who had seen all of her. She realized she was no longer just a pawn who could either stay on the board or get swept away. Instead of running, Zuri lunged toward the heavy medical cart she had used in the gym. Her curvy frame hit the metal with a thunderclap of force, sending it careening across the polished floor toward the assassin. The distraction was a flicker of something, surprise, respect on the killer's face, but it wasn't enough to stop him from readjusting his aim. The power shifted as Zuri realized she was the only one in the room with mobility. She grabbed a heavy, glass 4 bottle from the wreckage of the cart, her wide eyes locked onto the barrel of the gun. The unspoken threat of Minho's betrayal and Director Kim's tracking device had converged into this single, suffocating moment. She stood between the predator and his prey, her braids falling forward as she braced herself for a collision that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with survival. The assassin's gaze shifted to her, the pure venom in his eyes signaling that she was no longer a witness, but a target. Behind her, she heard the huge joystick console emit a violent, high-pitched whine as Duyun fought the iron-like certainty of his own physical limitations. The assassin's pistol clattered to the floor as Zuri's heavy glass 4 bottle connected with his wrist, but the victory was short-lived. Before she could recoil, the intruder lunged through the debris of the medical cart, his eyes locked forward with a pure venom that signaled he was done playing with silencers. He swept Zuri back against the cold marble wall, his hand locking onto her waist, not in intimacy, but to pin her. A serrated tactical knife flashed in the dim light, its edge pressed firmly against the vulnerable skin of her throat. "Don't move, nurse," the man hissed, his breath a foul contrast to the scent of sandalwood that usually filled the room. Zuri stood her ground despite the suffocating pressure, her braids falling forward as she stared at the restrained dominance flickering in Duyun's gaze. She saw the inner turmoil in him reach a breaking point, his jaw tight as he realized his beautiful cage was about to become her tomb. The huge joystick console emitted a final, violent, high-pitched whine as Duyun's neck tattoo pulsed with the rhythm of a terrifying focus. The power shifted in a way that defied every medical record and soul. With a thunderclap of effort that seemed to tear through the very fabric of his alleged paralysis, Nam Duyun didn't just move, he stood. The sight was miraculous and horrible all at once. He rose from the leather throne like a predator, seemingly waiting for a command to strike, his sharp features carved from stone as he took his first real step in 3 years. The assassin froze, his flicker of something, surprise, respect turning into pure terror as the paralyzed boss loomed over him, inches away. Duyun's hand, the one Zuri had felt burning with hidden life, shot out to seize the assassin's throat, the steel in his voice unmistakable even as his legs shook with the exertion of standing. He ripped the man away from Zuri, but as he did, his balance faltered. He was standing, but he was his limits against a body that was still healing into a new reality. As the two men crashed to the floor, the bedroom door was kicked open by a second wave of intruders, and Zuri realized that Duyun's greatest secret was now exposed to the very people who wanted him dead. The crash of Duyun's body hitting the marble floor sent a shockwave through the room, but the sound was eclipsed by the entry of Dr. Han. He didn't enter with a medical bag, but with the same cold, analytical stare he had used to pity Zuri on her first day. Behind him, the second wave of intruders lowered their weapons, not in surrender, but in deference. The power shifted violently as Zuri realized the man who had been running tests for months and claiming that damage is permanent was the same man now standing over his fallen patient with a smirk. "You should have stayed in the chair, Duyun," Dr. Han said, his voice as flat and matter-of-fact as it was when he had warned Zuri to follow protocols. He kicked the tactical knife away from the struggling assassin, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the flickering emergency lights. Zuri scrambled toward Duyun, her quiet strength turning into a bare vulnerability as she shielded his shaking frame. The inner turmoil on Duyun's face was devastating. He had been betrayed by someone he trusted once again. The new information was a blow that landed harder than any bullet. Dr. Han wasn't just a physician, he was the primary source of the leaks coming from inside the organization. He had been feeding information to the rival gangs and Minho, ensuring the recovery prognosis was zero by administering medications that suppressed nerve regeneration while reporting the opposite in secret. He was the one who had arranged the meeting and the ambush that originally broke Duyun's back. The director wanted the girl, but Minho wanted the empire, Han whispered, looking at Zuri with something approaching pity. He revealed that Zuri hadn't been hired for her skills, but as a pawn whose desperation made her the perfect distraction while Han finalized the coup. Duyun's neck tattoo pulsed with a lethal clarity as he tried to find his footing, his hands clutched against the carpet in agony. He had orchestrated outcomes like chess moves, but he had failed to see the viper in his own medical team. As Dr. Han pulled a syringe from his pocket, filled with a dark, unmanifested pharmaceutical, the sound of sirens grew louder outside, but they weren't the police. A third, unknown frequency began to override the huge joystick console, and the unspoken threat shifted from the room to the entire estate as the shadow medical supply chain began to self-destruct. The syringe in Dr. Han's hand glowed under the emergency lights, a lethal promise aimed at Duyun's heart. Zuri braced her curvy frame against the paralyzed boss, her wide eyes locked on the doctor who had turned from healer to executioner. But as Han stepped forward, Duyun's jaw-tight expression shifted into a chilling, satisfied edge. He didn't look like a man at the end of his rope, he looked like a predator who had finally closed the trap. "You think you were suppressing my nerves, Han?" Duyun's voice was no longer a jagged rasp but of low, iron-like certainty. With a movement that was precise, powerful, and entirely too fast, he swept his leg, the one Han claimed was dead weight, and knocked the syringe from the doctor's grip. He stood fully now, his sharp features projecting a restrained dominance that made the intruders hesitate. The rehab secret was more than just a hidden twitch. Do-yoon revealed that he had known about Han's betrayal of the blood for weeks. He had been testing his limits in secret, using Zuri's nursing instincts and emotional intensity not just for care, but as a beautiful cage to hide his progress from the cameras Han was monitoring. I needed a witness, Do-yoon whispered, his neck tattoo pulsing as he stepped toward the trembling doctor. I needed everyone to believe I was a pawn so I could see who would try to sweep me off the board. Zuri wasn't my distraction, Han. She was my shield. The power shifted as Zuri realized the forbidden tension and bare vulnerability she had shared with him were part of a complex web of truth and deception. She felt a flicker of something, surprise, respect, but it was buried under the sting of being a tool in his rehab and revenge. She had been staying because she loved him, but he had been using that love to mask his miraculous recovery. As Do-yoon loomed over Han, the huge joystick console suddenly emitted a new, high-pitched frequency. The shadow medical supply chain wasn't just self-destructing, it was being hijacked. A new face appeared on the cracked monitors, Minho, the brother who had broken him, and the unspoken threat became a countdown. You can walk, brother, the screen hissed, but let's see if you can run before the estate becomes your funeral pyre. The smell of gas began to hiss through the vents, and Zuri realized that even with Do-yoon's legs back, they were trapped in a fortress that was seconds away from an inferno. The hiss of gas through the vents turned the air into a volatile weight, but Do-yoon's miraculous recovery had left his physical strength spent. He collapsed back into the leather throne, his legs shaking slightly from the exertion of standing, leaving the huge joystick as their only weapon. The power shifted entirely as he grabbed Zuri's hand, pulling her toward the console. I can't move the chair and the data at the same time, he rasped, his neck tattoo pulsing with a desperate focus. You have to handle the joystick. You have to be my hands. Zuri didn't hesitate, her quiet strength overriding the bare vulnerability of being used as a mask. She stepped behind the chair, her curvy frame bracing against the frame as she gripped the huge joystick. It wasn't just a steering column, it was a sophisticated interface for digital warfare. Under Do-yoon's whispered commands, Zuri navigated the flickering screens, her fingers moving with nursing instincts turned into tactical precision. She realized then that the shadow medical supply chain was the key to their escape. She didn't just steer the chair toward the back stairwell, she used the console to take control of the organization's logistics. She began rerouting the unmanifested pharmaceuticals and shipping manifests, creating a digital smokescreen that confused Minho's hijackers. By handling the joystick, she was systematically locking the traders into the estate's own automated security wings, turning the beautiful cage against the men who had built it. You're doing it, Do-yoon whispered, his dark eyes watching her with a flicker of something, surprise, respect. But the victory was a trap dressed as an opportunity. As Zuri initiated the final lockdown, she saw a new face appear on the primary monitor, not Minho, but Director Kim. He had used the tracking device in her own medical kit to bypass the firewall Zuri was trying to build. The unspoken threat was no longer just the gas, the director had remotely triggered a termination clause in the estate's mainframe. A digital countdown appeared on the huge joystick console, and Zuri realized that by trapping the traitors, she might have just locked herself and Do-yoon into a beautiful cage that was set to detonate in 60 seconds. The digital countdown on the console reached 0 just as Zuri and Do-yoon breached the estate's final perimeter, the explosion behind them turning the beautiful cage into a funeral pyre for the ghosts of the past. They fled not to safety, but to the industrial heart of the city, the Seoul docks, where the shadow medical supply chain met the sea. The air was thick with the scent of salt and diesel, a stark contrast to the expensive leather of their former prison. Do-yoon stood at the edge of a massive shipping container, his legs shaking slightly but his posture radiating an authority that didn't require a chair. He had walked into the lion's den without a weapon, his sharp features carved from stone as he faced the men who had betrayed him. Minho and Director Kim stood together, a network of obligations and loyalties surrounding them, their eyes locked forward with a pure venom. "You've learned too much, Zuri," Minho hissed, his voice a low, jagged rasp that mirrored his brother's. The power shifted as Zuri realized the final purge wasn't just about the Empire, it was about the tracking device and the unmanifested pharmaceuticals that linked the hospital's corruption to the Mafia's greed. She stood by Duyun's side, her quiet strength a shield against the unspoken threat of the armed men circling them. The new information came as a thunderclap. Minho revealed that the ambush that originally broke Duyun was funded by the hospital's private offshore accounts, a transaction that turned blood into profit. Duyun didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for the huge joystick console he had salvaged, his neck tattoo pulsing as he initiated a final, digital warfare strike. "In my world, weakness gets you killed," Duyun whispered, his dark eyes locking onto his brother's with a lethal clarity. He didn't order a hit, he released the shipping manifests and encrypted records to the Ministry of Justice in real time, effectively dismantling every alliance his enemies had built. The final purge had begun, but as the police sirens wailed in the distance, Minho pulled a hidden tactical knife, the steel in his voice unmistakable as he lunged for the vulnerable space between the two brothers. The confrontation had turned from a chess move into a desperate struggle for survival, and as the first shot rang out across the docks, Zuri realized the truth might not set them free, but bury them both. The chaos of the docks faded into the distance as the high-tech fortress of the Nam estate underwent a silent, profound transformation. The huge joystick was gone, replaced by the weight of a new responsibility that felt far heavier than the motorized chair. On the glass-walled balcony overlooking the glittering sprawl of Seoul, Nam Duyun stood without assistance, his sharp features no longer a mask of restrained dominance but reflecting a vulnerable honesty. Beside him, Zuri watched the city lights, her quiet strength finally at peace, her braids falling forward in the gentle night wind. The new reign had begun not with a roar of violence, but with a total unmasking of the secrets that had kept them in a beautiful cage. Duyun revealed that the shipping manifests he had released weren't just a weapon against Minho, but a blueprint to turn the shadow medical supply chain into a legitimate foundation for those priced out of survival. The power had shifted from a complex web of truth and deception to a partnership based on who we actually are, not who we think we need to be. "The wheelchair was my shield, Zuri, but you were my truth," Duyun whispered, his neck tattoo visible above a collar that was finally relaxed. He reached out, his hand locking onto her waist with a tenderness that replaced the iron-like certainty of the past. He was no longer the paralyzed boss, and she was no longer the desperate nurse. They were two damaged people choosing each other in the ruins of an empire. However, as the dawn began to break over the horizon, a single, encrypted notification chirped from the new security console behind them. It wasn't a threat from the director or a ghost from the coup, but a message from the Ministry of Justice. The final purge had left a paper trail that even Duyun couldn't fully erase, and the legal exposure he had warned her about was no longer a theory. He looked at Zuri, his dark eyes searching hers for the stubborn determination he knew was there. They were finally standing together, no more wheelchairs, no more lies, but the city below was already waking up with new questions, and the unresolved pressure of the law was beginning to circle the balcony like a predator that refused to be ignored. Zuri and Duyun have finally stepped out of the shadows, but in a world built on deception, the truth often carries the highest price. If you were Zuri, would you stay to face the Ministry of Justice, or would you take your chance to run? Drop your choice in the comments below. If this story of power, revenge, and forbidden tension kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe to Afro-love Underworld. Don't miss our next story, because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is fall in love with a man who has nothing left to lose.